Doctors gave him less than a 5% chance to live. Then a relic of Our Lady of Guadalupe entered his ICU room. On a spring day in Los Angeles in 2002, a 42-year-old father lay unconscious in a hospital bed while his family faced a possibility almost too painful to accept. Vicente Cornejo had suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm. According to his wife, Alma, he had fallen into a coma and even flatlined while being rushed to the hospital. The message his family received was devastating. His chance of survival was less than 5%. And even if he survived, doctors warned that the damage to his brain could change everything. But that was only the beginning. Over the following days, Vicente would survive one crisis only to enter another. There would be emergency brain drainage, a delicate procedure to seal the aneurysm, infection, meningitis, dangerously high fever, and the possibility that he might never walk normally or recognize his own family again. Then doctors encountered another problem. Vicente's brain was still unable to properly regulate its fluid. More than 90% of that fluid was being drained through an external tube. The medical team expected that he would need a permanent shunt implanted in his body. But Vicente's wife remembered something she had heard 11 years earlier. Somewhere in Los Angeles, preserved by the Catholic Church, was an extraordinarily small relic connected to one of the most famous Marian images in the world, a tiny fragment of the tilma of Saint Juan Diego, the cloak associated with Our Lady of Guadalupe. Alma asked if that relic could be brought to her husband's hospital room. What happened during the following 4 days would become a story the Cornejo family would continue telling for years. A story of medicine, a story of prayer, and a story that, even today, must be told carefully. Because the Catholic Church has not formally declared what happened to Vicente Cornejo a Vatican-recognized miracle. What follows is the family's testimony and the remarkable sequence of events they say unfolded inside a Los Angeles hospital. Before we continue, if you appreciate true stories about Catholic faith lived in extraordinary real-world circumstances, consider subscribing to Grace Beyond the Headlines. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from today, because this story begins not in 2002, but more than a decade earlier. In December of 1991, Alma Cornejo attended a novena honoring Our Lady of Guadalupe at St. Finbar Catholic Church in Burbank, California. For Catholics of Mexican heritage, Our Lady of Guadalupe carries a significance that is difficult to reduce to a single feast day. The traditional account goes back to December 1531. According to Catholic tradition, the Virgin Mary appeared to an indigenous convert named Juan Diego on Tepeyac Hill, near what is now Mexico City. When Juan Diego eventually opened his tilma before Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, roses fell from the cloak, and on the fabric was an image of the Virgin Mary. That tilma remains inside the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, and has become one of the most recognized religious images in the Americas. But during the novena in Burbank in 1991, Alma heard something she had not known before. Father Peter Irving told those gathered that Los Angeles possessed something extraordinary, a tiny fragment connected to Juan Diego's tilma. At that time, the relic was being preserved by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles at its archival center at Mission San Fernando. The fragment had a history of its own. Half a century earlier, in 1941, Los Angeles Archbishop John J. Cantwell had led a pilgrimage to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. After that visit, Archbishop Luis Maria Martinez of Mexico City sent Archbishop Cantwell a small piece of the tilma. Eventually, that fragment came into the care of the Los Angeles Archdiocesan Archives. For most people attending that novena in 1991, it may have been a fascinating historical detail. For Alma, it became something stored quietly in memory. She had no idea that 11 years later, sitting beside her critically ill husband, she would suddenly remember it. The crisis began on May 3rd. Vicente Cornejo was only 42. He was a husband and father. He was involved in Catholic life and, according to Alma's later account, had served as an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. His life was not supposed to become a medical emergency that Friday. but a cerebral aneurysm ruptured inside his head. A brain aneurysm is a weakened area in the wall of a blood vessel. When one ruptures, blood can suddenly enter the space surrounding the brain. The consequences can be catastrophic. Vicente lost consciousness. According to Alma, he went into a coma. Then, while he was being transported to the hospital, his heart stopped. For the Cornejo family, the world they had known only hours earlier disappeared. Doctors were now talking in percentages, less than 5%. That, Alma later wrote, was the chance her family was given for Vicente's survival. They were warned that he might not make it through the night. 2 priests came independently to administer the anointing of the sick. It is a sacrament sometimes misunderstood as something reserved only for the final minutes of life. In Catholic teaching, however, the anointing of the sick is offered to those seriously weakened by illness or facing grave medical circumstances, a prayer for strength, healing, and, when death approaches, preparation. While priests prayed, doctors worked. Vicente needed emergency intervention to relieve pressure inside his skull. A ventriculostomy was performed. A catheter was inserted so that cerebrospinal fluid, along with blood accumulating after the hemorrhage, could be drained outside the body. For the moment, the goal was simple. Keep him alive, get him through the night, then determine whether anything more could be done. The next day was Saturday, May 4th. Somewhere outside the hospital, another family was celebrating something completely different. A 10-year-old boy named Ian, a friend of the Cornejo family, was making his first Holy Communion. For a Catholic child, First Communion is one of the defining moments of early religious life. There would normally be photographs, family members, special clothes, and celebration. But Ian knew that Vicente was fighting for his life. So according to Alma, the boy offered his first communion for Vicente. Alma later recalled something that became deeply meaningful to the family. Around the time Ian received communion, Vicente awoke from his coma. It is important to describe this exactly as the family did. The timing became significant to them. It is not evidence by itself that one event medically caused the other. But for a family who had spent the previous night preparing for death, Vicente opening his eyes was the first crack of light in an almost completely dark situation. He had survived the first night. But surviving the rupture did not mean the crisis was over. Far from it. Vicente was eventually transferred to USC University Hospital, the Los Angeles Medical Center now known as Keck Hospital of USC. There, specialists faced the aneurysm itself. Traditionally, some cerebral aneurysms had been treated through open surgery, using a clip to isolate the weakened blood vessel. But doctors had another option for Vicente: endovascular coiling. Instead of opening the skull, physicians could navigate through the blood vessels and place tiny coils inside the aneurysm, encouraging clotting and reducing the chance of further bleeding. Today, endovascular techniques are familiar parts of neurovascular medicine. But in 2002, coiling was still relatively new compared with the decades-long history of surgical clipping. The FDA had approved the Guglielmi detachable coil system only several years earlier. For the Cornejo family, advanced medicine now offered Vicente something that had seemed almost impossible the previous evening: a path forward. The doctors successfully treated the aneurysm with coils. Another catastrophe had been avoided. But the brain is not like a broken bone that can simply be repaired and left to heal. The blood from Vicente's rupture had affected one of the body's most delicate systems, and the next problem became apparent. His brain was not properly regulating cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid normally circulates around the brain and spinal cord. After a severe hemorrhage, that circulation can become obstructed. Pressure can build. This condition, known as hydrocephalus, can itself become dangerous. Vicente already had an external drain, but according to Alma, more than 90% of the fluid needed to be drained into the external collection system. That meant his body had not yet resumed normal regulation. Doctors believed a permanent shunt might be required. A shunt is a tube, surgically implanted, to redirect excess cerebrospinal fluid from the brain to another part of the body, often the abdomen, where it can be absorbed. For many patients, a shunt can be life-saving. There is nothing inherently extraordinary about needing one after a brain hemorrhage. Nor is it medically impossible for some patients eventually to recover enough not to require permanent shunting. But in Vicente's individual case, according to Alma's testimony, his doctors had reached the point where they expected the procedure would be necessary. Still, he was not yet stable. And another frightening complication arrived. Sunday, May 12, 2002, was Mother's Day. For Alma, there would be no ordinary celebration. Her husband had now spent days in intensive care. He had survived an aneurysm that doctors initially believed he probably would not survive. He had undergone emergency drainage. His aneurysm had been treated, but neurological recovery remained uncertain. At times, according to Alma, Vicente did not recognize the people around him, not even his wife. Imagine sitting beside the person with whom you have built a life, speaking his name, waiting for his eyes to show recognition, and realizing that the person looking back may not know who you are. Then the situation became worse. Vicente developed meningitis. An infection involving the tissues around the brain and spinal cord was especially dangerous in a patient already dealing with major neurological injury and an external ventricular drain. According to Alma, he also suffered pancreatitis and hepatitis. His fever became severe. Hospital staff placed him on what Alma described as an ice blanket in an effort to bring his temperature down. Antibiotics were being used. But Alma remembered that he was not responding as hoped. And because of the infection, placing the permanent shunt became more complicated. The shunt was supposed to solve one problem. The infection was now making that solution difficult. Doctors also warned the family about Vicente's neurological future. Even survival might come with profound limitations. Would he walk again? Would he recognize the people he loved? Would he ever return to anything resembling his old life? Alma could not know. All she knew was that medical professionals continued to fight for him, and that her family continued to pray. Different priests visited. A Norbertine priest celebrated Mass in the hospital room. An Opus Dei priest came regularly. Religious images appeared around Vicente. Friends and relatives prayed. None of this replaced his physicians. None of it was offered instead of medicine. It happened beside medicine. That distinction matters. The Cornejo family was not choosing between prayer and doctors. They were depending on both in very different ways. And then Alma remembered something. Something from December 1991. A tiny piece of cloth. A Marian relic somewhere in Los Angeles. The fragment of Juan Diego's tilma. The person responsible for the relic was Monsignor Francis J. Weber. For decades, Misgersert Weber served as archivist for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He was a historian as well as a priest, someone entrusted with preserving the documentary and material history of Catholic life in Southern California. Among the objects under the Archdiocese's care was that small Guadalupe relic. Alma contacted him. Her request was extraordinary in its simplicity. Would he bring it to Vicente? There was no promise, no guarantee, no official declaration that this relic had healing powers. Alma was simply asking for a sacred object associated in her faith with the Virgin Mary to be brought into the room where her husband was suffering, and Mr. Weber agreed. On May 15, 2002, the relic came to the hospital. Try to imagine the contrast. All around Vicente were the instruments of modern critical care, monitoring equipment, intravenous lines, a drainage catheter emerging from his head, medication, doctors, nurses, the machines and procedures that had kept him alive after a devastating hemorrhage. And entering this clinical environment was something physically tiny, a fragment of old woven material. About the size of a fingernail. For Catholics, its significance had nothing to do with its monetary value. It represented a physical connection to the tilma associated with Our Lady of Guadalupe. Mesker Weber prayed. He blessed Vicente. Alma prayed too. Then the relic left the room. There was no sudden awakening. No dramatic moment when every monitor changed at once. No instant Hollywood recovery. Instead, according to Alma's account, something much quieter began to happen. And it happened in numbers. Before the visit, Alma said that more than 90% of Vicente's cerebrospinal fluid needed to be diverted through the external drain. The following day, May 16th, she said that figure had fallen, approximately 50%. It could have been encouraging, but in an ICU, one encouraging number rarely means the crisis is finished. Doctors watch trends. Hours matter. Complications can reverse progress quickly. The family waited. Then came the next day. May 17th. According to Alma, Vicente's need for external drainage decreased again, from approximately 50% to 25%. The permanent shunt had been discussed because Vicente's brain appeared unable to regulate the fluid on its own. Now, according to the family's account, that dependency seemed to be rapidly diminishing. They continued to watch. Friday passed, then Saturday, then Sunday, May 19th. Alma said the external drainage requirement reached 0, 90, 50, 25, 0 in only a few days. Vicente ultimately did not need the permanent shunt. For Alma, there was no ambiguity about what she believed had happened. She saw those days through the eyes of faith. She associated the sudden improvement with the visit of the Tilma relic and the prayers offered through the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe. But the way this story is told matters. Modern medicine recognizes that some patients with hydrocephalus after subarachnoid hemorrhage can improve without requiring a permanent shunt. So the simple fact that Vicente eventually avoided shunt surgery does not, by itself, establish a supernatural event. The extraordinary element in Alma's testimony is the specific sequence she describes: the severity of her husband's condition, the medical team's expectation that a shunt would be required, and the rapid change she says occurred immediately after the relic's visit. Then came one more moment she would remember for years. Around the following day, according to Alma, a group of approximately 15 doctors, neurologists, and medical students entered Vicente's room. They reviewed him. They reviewed the situation, and the lead physician spoke with Alma. Years later, writing publicly about the experience, Alma remembered his words. "Mrs. Cornejo, I don't know who you prayed to, but if I ever need a miracle, I'll be calling you." It is important to understand what this quotation represents. It is Alma's recollection of what the doctor said. It is not a Vatican medical finding. It is not a transcript from a hospital record. It does not mean that medicine officially classified Vicente's recovery as supernatural. But imagine what those words meant to a woman who, less than 3 weeks earlier, had been told that her husband had less than a 5% chance of surviving. For Alma, the answer to the doctor's question was already clear. She had prayed to God. She had asked the Virgin Mary to intercede. And when she had reached a moment when she believed her husband desperately needed help, she had remembered a fragment of a tilma she first heard about 11 years before. The family saw everything that followed through that lens. If you're listening, and this story has touched you, tell us in the comments what stands out most: the medicine, the family's persistence in prayer, or the strange chain of timing that connected a memory from 1991 with an ICU room in 2002. Because even after the numbers reached 0, Vicente still had another journey ahead of him. He had survived, but survival and recovery are not the same thing. Vicente remained in the hospital. The hemorrhage had been severe. His body had endured enormous trauma. There was neurological damage to overcome. There were infections and other complications. His recovery had to be measured not only in scans and drainage percentages, but in the small functions most people rarely think about until they are threatened: recognition, movement, communication, awareness, strength, the ability to return home. Then came June 6, 2002. Just over 1 month after the aneurysm ruptured, Vicente Cornejo went home. For his family, the moment must have felt almost impossible when compared with the words they had heard on May 3. Less than 5%. He might not survive the night. Now he was leaving the hospital. But this story becomes more credible, and perhaps more moving, because Alma never claimed that everything instantly returned to normal. Vicente did not simply wake up one morning exactly as he had been before the hemorrhage. The event changed his life. Years later, Alma said that Vicente was unable to return to his previous job. His survival had consequences. There were things he lost. There were limits he carried forward. That matters because genuine human stories rarely end like movies. There is usually no moment when every scar disappears. Sometimes grace, for believers, is not understood as getting the old life back. Sometimes it is receiving more life when almost none was expected. There was another layer to Alma and Vicente's story. Before the aneurysm, the couple had already known grief. According to Alma, they had experienced 5 miscarriages, 5 pregnancies, 5 losses. That history meant their family had already lived with prayer that did not always end in the outcome they wanted. This is important. Faith in the Cornejo story was not based on the idea that every prayer produces the desired result. They already knew that it did not. After Vicente's recovery, however, the family welcomed another daughter. They named her Frances Marie. For Alma, even the name carried meaning, connected with gratitude and devotion. Eventually, Vicente became the father of 5 children. The man once assigned less than a 5% chance of survival was now living in the middle of a family that had once been warned they were about to lose him. Music remained part of his life. So did Catholic faith. Years later, the family was associated with Guardian Angel Catholic Church in Pacoima. Vicente never returned completely to the life that existed before May 3, 2002. But he had a life, a wife, children, music, church, ordinary days, birthdays, meals, arguments, laughter. All the small experiences that become enormous when you nearly lose them forever. Meanwhile, the small fragment of the Guadalupe tilma continued its own journey. For years, it had been preserved quietly by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Then more Catholics were given the opportunity to encounter it. In 2003, the relic traveled through more than 20 American cities. Nearly a decade later, it was given a permanent and far more visible home. At the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in downtown Los Angeles, a chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe was established. Today, the cathedral describes the object as the only known fragment of the tilma in the United States. Behind protective glass, the tiny piece seems visually modest compared with the importance believers attach to it. Visitors can stand only a few feet away. Some come because of devotion, some because of history, some because they know stories like Vicente's. And in 2019, 17 years after that hospital room visit, Alma and Vicente Cornejo returned. The relic was no longer hidden away inside an archival center. It was now displayed inside one of the most prominent Catholic churches in America. The same tiny fragment that Mrs. Francis Weber had carried to Vicente's bedside in 2002 was now before them again. Only this time, Vicente was not lying unconscious. He was standing with his wife, alive. This is the point where stories like this can easily become exaggerated. A dramatic headline becomes a claim. A family's testimony becomes scientific proof. And before long, details that were once carefully qualified are repeated as certainty. That would do a disservice to Vicente's story. Doctors unquestionably played an enormous role in saving his life. Emergency intervention relieved pressure in his brain. Modern neurovascular medicine allowed specialists to treat the ruptured aneurysm with endovascular coils. Antibiotics and intensive medical care addressed life-threatening complications. Nurses and doctors watched him around the clock. None of those facts weakened the Cornejo family's faith. In their understanding, medicine and prayer were never enemies. The question is not whether doctors helped Vicente. They clearly did. The more difficult question is how to understand what happened during those days after May 15. Why did his need for cerebrospinal fluid drainage fall as Alma described? Why did the permanent shunt ultimately become unnecessary? Could his body have reached that point through a medically possible natural recovery? Yes. Recovery without permanent shunting can happen. Was the speed and timing striking enough that Vicente's own physicians were surprised? According to Alma, absolutely. Did Alma and her family believe the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe was involved? Without question. Has the Vatican formally investigated and recognized the Cornejo case as an authenticated miracle? There is no evidence that it has. and perhaps the most respectful way to tell the story is to leave those facts beside one another, not to force them into a conclusion they cannot support, because faith does not always begin where science ends. For many families sitting inside hospital rooms, the two exist at exactly the same time. The surgeon performs the procedure. The nurse adjusts the medication. The family holds a rosary. A priest enters. A monitor continues beeping, and everyone waits. Perhaps one of the strangest parts of the story is not even the medical improvement. It is Alma's memory. In 1991, she sat in a church in Burbank and heard that Los Angeles possessed a fragment of Juan Diego's tilma. There was no reason then to imagine an intensive care unit. No aneurysm, no emergency surgery, no meningitis, no shunt, just a piece of information heard during a Guadalupe novena. 11 years passed. Then, in the middle of one of the worst moments of her life, that memory returned. She remembered the relic. She remembered where it was. She found the man responsible for it. And she asked him to come. For someone without Alma's faith, that may simply be an unusual chain of events. For Alma, it was something more. And that difference in interpretation is central to understanding the story. Faith does not always claim to provide a laboratory measurement. Sometimes it gives people a framework through which they understand timing, survival, suffering, and gratitude. Alma saw the visit of the Guadalupe Relic as part of the reason her husband was still alive. 17 years later, she was still willing to put that conviction into writing publicly. If this were a fictional miracle story, this is where Vicente might return to work immediately, run a marathon and live without any lasting effect from his ruptured aneurysm. That did not happen. The real ending is quieter. Vicente survived something that very nearly killed him. He carried consequences afterward. He could not return to his former employment. His life was altered, but he remained with his family, and perhaps that is precisely why the story has lasted. The family did not receive the restoration of every single thing. They received Vicente, and for Alma, that was enough to continue saying thank you. Imagine them in 2019. Downtown Los Angeles, outside the cathedral. Cars moving along the streets. Visitors entering and leaving. The massive bronze doors. The stone walls. And somewhere inside, behind glass, a piece of cloth only about a centimeter across. 17 years earlier, Miskerstrun. Weber had carried that fragment through the doors of a hospital where Vicente's future was being measured in percentages. Less than 5% chance of survival. More than 90% of his cerebrospinal fluid being externally drained. Then 50. Then 25. Then 0. Now there was no drainage bag. No ice blanket. No emergency phone call. Vicente was simply there, standing beside Alma, the woman who had been told he might not survive the night. There are moments when a headline is not enough. Man survives brain aneurysm. True. Catholic family prays with Guadalupe Relic. Also true. But neither sentence captures the hospital corridors, the neurological uncertainty, the physicians working to save a dying patient, the priests coming quietly to his bedside, or a wife remembering something she had heard 11 years earlier. And neither sentence can tell us with scientific certainty why Vicente's recovery unfolded exactly as it did. What we can say is this. On May 3, 2002, Vicente Cornejo suffered a devastating ruptured brain aneurysm. His wife says doctors gave him less than a 5% chance of survival. He underwent major emergency treatment. He developed serious complications. His doctors expected he would need permanent cerebrospinal fluid shunting. On May 15th, Mr. Francis J. Weber brought a small fragment associated with the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe to his hospital room and prayed with him. According to Alma, Vicente's external drainage requirement then fell from more than 90% to 50 to 25 and finally to 0. He never received the permanent shunt. On June 6 he went home, and 17 years later he and Alma were still together, standing before that same relic and remembering the month when everything almost ended. The Church has not formally declared Vicente's recovery a recognized miracle. But for Alma Cornejo and her family, there was never much uncertainty about how they understood it. Medicine fought for Vicente's life. People prayed for Vicente's life. And somehow, against an almost unimaginable prognosis, Vicente came home. Sometimes grace appears in something spectacular. Sometimes it arrives quietly through a surgeon's hands, a child's first communion, a priest carrying a tiny piece of cloth through a hospital corridor, and a family given more time together than they thought they had. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Grace Beyond the Headlines for more documented stories of Catholic faith lived in the real world. And before you leave, tell us in the comments, when you hear a story like Vicente Cornejo's, what speaks to you most? The extraordinary medical recovery, the persistence of his family, or the faith that helped them endure every uncertain day? Because behind every headline, there is a human story, and sometimes there is grace beyond it.